Undercover boss orders coffee at Coffeehouse freezes when waitress says tips could feed everyone with one fix. The faint morning light shone on the cold gray tile floor, making the atmosphere inside the small coffeehouse nestled between streets feel even more subdued. Michael Foster, 50 years old CEO and founder of the famous Morning Glow Cafe coffeehouse chain, sat pensively at an old wooden table in a corner of the shop, a place he had once proudly called the second home of the hardworking staff. He wore an ordinary shirt with a worn-out baseball cap to avoid familiar glances, all to disguise himself as an unfamiliar customer, someone no one would guess was the very soul of this brand. In a fleeting moment, as his eyes swept across the cafe, Michael suddenly noticed a young waitress walking over. The girl's hair was hurriedly tied up her frayed apron clinging to her thin frame. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the hot coffee cup on the table. Her breathing was labored and her voice quivered, as if carrying a burden she'd never had the chance to voice. If the tips here were shared fairly, I and everyone else could afford a proper meal every day. Michael froze. Every word she uttered was like a cold blade slicing into his heart, the heart of a founder who had once believed and hoped that this place would be a safe haven for hardworking people. In that moment, every sound around him seemed to disappear, leaving only the thudding of his own heart, merging with the girl's glistening eyes that held hidden fear and a fragile hope for fairness. He looked at her, and her face appeared weary, marked by beads of sweat on her forehead, a testament to the endless working hours, the small shoulders bearing a burden she hadn't yet dared to name. The yellow light shone down, illuminating the gloomy expression of a staff member caught in a web of injustice, a web he, the founder, had inadvertently allowed to slip through the cracks. Outside, a light drizzle fell, like a thin veil separating the inside world from the hustle and bustle of the city. Inside, Michael knew he had just touched upon a harsh truth. All the values he had once set for this coffeehouse, chain trust, fairness, hope for a warm workplace, were gradually being distorted, turning into a burden that left young people like this girl unable to afford dinner each day. That moment seemed frozen in time, then shattered into 1,000 pieces. Each shard reflected a painful question Michael could no longer avoid. Had he himself unknowingly become an accomplice to the very injustice he had always believed he was fighting? Just one sentence. But for Michael, it was a wake-up call, a tolling bell deep inside the heart of a man who had once been proud of Sunrise Cafe, of the second home he had built from the very first tips. Now those very tips, the reward he believed to be just and deserved, had become the most painful cut, severing the trust between him and the people he once called family. Amid the clicking sounds of the POS machine at the cashier counter, Michael knew. It was time to face it. There was no way back. Every tear, every dollar tip, every gaze from those who once believed in him, all were waiting for an explanation, a decision, a step bold enough to save Sunrise Cafe from the very storm of injustice, sweeping away all the values he had once sweat to build. Just one sentence, but it revealed all the injustice right at the cafe Michael had once proudly called the second home. A light morning drizzle hung like a thin curtain across the street, leaving dull streaks of light reflected under the yellow streetlights. In the chilly air, the small coffeehouse, a humble branch of the prestigious Morning Glow Cafe chain, opened its doors to welcome guests. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans lingered in the space, blending with the low hum of the grinder and the clinking of cups and saucers, like a familiar symphony of cozy mornings. In a corner of the cafe near the glass window, a man sat silently, his hand gently holding a steaming cup of coffee. The yellow light highlighted his graying hair, revealing deep, thoughtful eyes. The eyes of a founder who had poured his heart into making Morning Glow a second home for hardworking staff. At 50 years old, the CEO of Morning Glow Cafe no longer wore an expensive suit or his usual confident smile seen on stage. Instead, he wore a simple shirt with his sleeves lightly rolled up, bearing the ordinary look of a customer enjoying his morning coffee. Inside the cafe, wooden tables gleamed from years of use and paintings on the walls evoked the brand's history, all telling the story of a dream. A dream of a warm, fair workplace where every dollar tip was shared fairly and staff were known by name, not just as a number. He himself had lit that dream the day he was still a young man, personally making every first cup of coffee, proudly splitting every small tip with staff. But recently, that dream seemed to be tainted by strange rumors. Rumors of tips being manipulated, of managers showing favoritism of young staff, leaving exhausted and disillusioned. Brief calls reporting declining revenue, customer complaints about declining service quality, all had awakened in him a simmering worry, an unanswered question. Had Morning Glow itself betrayed the promise of fairness once made? So, this morning he decided to disguise himself as an anonymous customer, hiding his authoritative CEO image, even hiding his founder's name to see for himself what was happening. His eyes scanned each gaze, each pair of quick-moving hands of the staff, each hurried step in the coffee shop he had once called the second home. Warm steam rose from the ceramic cup in his hand, but his heart grew cold, as if bracing for a cruel truth that was about to be revealed. A bustling morning, the yellow light from the bar counter cast down on the polished tile floor, illuminating the tired eyes of the staff rushing to serve coffee and pastries. Michael Foster, 50-year-old CEO and founder of Morning Glow Cafe, sat quietly in a corner, his hand gently swirling the half-empty cup of coffee, his eyes tense as he observed every small detail, as if seeking an answer to the worries gnawing at his heart. Amid hurried footsteps, his gaze met Lily's, a young girl whose hands trembled as she gently placed a steaming cup of coffee on the table. Her hair was messy from a shift that had started at dawn, and her face bore the marks of fatigue mingled with resignation. The aroma of pastries lingered, but her eyes were empty. Her voice trembled, breaking into words she had perhaps never dared to speak. Tips here, if they were shared fairly, I and everyone else could afford a proper meal every day. Those words fell like a cold knife into Michael's heart. He remembered clearly the first day Morning Glow opened, when he himself stood behind the counter, splitting each dollar of tips, seeing hope light up in everyone's eyes. Now that hope had vanished, leaving only the tired lines on the faces of young staff like Lily. Before he could collect himself, he heard a voice softly speaking, a janitor's voice holding a mop, eyes staring into the distance like a monologue. Here, the one who works the most is also the one who gets the least. That sentence squeezed all the air out of Michael's lungs. His heart felt like it was being crushed inside his chest. His eyes followed Lily, suddenly realizing the spark of hope in her had been extinguished at some point. And more than that, that one sentence revealed a harsh reality he had never thought could happen in his own cafe chain. A place he had once believed was fair and humane, where every brick, every table, every cup of coffee had been placed by his own hands and heart. In that moment, Michael felt the deep pain of those living in the darkness of injustice, those people he had once called family. And he knew, if he didn't stand up tomorrow, there would be more tears, like Lily's falling onto this cafe floor, a place once called a second home. Michael sat in a daze in the coffee house, a place he had once proudly called his employees' second home. Under the yellow light cast down from the bar counter, he saw the shadows of people flitting by like puzzle pieces that no longer fit into the dream he once had. The coffee cup in his hand had long grown cold, but the heat of injustice still simmered throughout the space. He noticed a group of young employees' uniforms crisp, walking leisurely, as if every reward had been predetermined. They smiled, exchanged glances filled with arrogance, the kind of look only those with hidden power would recognize. Each of their steps through the cafe sounded like a knife etching deep into his memory of the early days, the days when every tip was split fairly with humanity and decency. But today their eyes reflected only a cold light, privilege. In the corner of the cafe, Lily, the young girl whose hands trembled that morning, was still struggling to clean. The yellow light poured down on her hair, highlighting salty sweat. She bowed her head, eyes adrift like someone lost in the crowd, as if she herself wondered, where do I belong? Every movement of hers was slow, heavy, as if each step was treading on the trust Michael had spent a lifetime building. Michael gripped the table tightly, his fingers turning white as he clung to a sliver of hope. His gaze rested on the POS counter, where the cold blue light from the computer screen shone on the indifferent face of a young employee. The boy's fingers danced deftly over the screen, like an artist on a keyboard, each beep echoing like a blade slicing straight into Michael's heart. He could see every tip amount appear and then disappear, as if that cold blue light was devouring the sweat and tears of people like Lily. The pain surged within him like a hammer blow to his chest, the pain of a founder who once believed that as long as tips were distributed fairly, every drop of sweat would be justly rewarded. He recalled those first mornings when he himself divided each tip for his staff, how their eyes then sparkled, eyes filled with trust and fairness, eyes that he believed were the eyes of a true family. But now Lily was different. That gaze was now marked by fear and helplessness. Michael knew she had bravely documented the evidence, every missing tip, every unfair shift schedule, every threatening message to the vulnerable staff. Those small pieces of paper, the trembling lines of handwriting like silent cries for help. He imagined her trembling hand putting pen to paper, her eyes darting around like a thief in the night. Afraid, yet she still did it. Michael took a deep breath. His breath mingled with the sighs of the young people who once believed this place was their second home. He heard his own heartbeat, each thump like a vow not yet spoken. Did I let this happen? The yellow light cast down on his face, revealing every crow's foot traces of time of sleepless nights spent building a morning glow cafe that was fair and humane. Michael understood this wasn't just a fight with a fraudulent POS system. It was a fight to reclaim trust. The trust he had once poured his heart into building. And he knew just one decision, one click could bring it all back to life. Michael squinted at the group of favorite employees standing behind the bar. Their eyes were glued to the POS screen with a strange delight. The blue glow from the screen illuminated their cold expressions. One of them, a stiff-faced man with perfectly styled hair, looked at the other servers with a mocking smirk, occasionally letting out a sly chuckle. Michael saw that smirk. It was exactly like the smirk of those who had sold out trust for cheap privileges. He clenched his jaw and his breathing quickened. That laughter felt like a blade slicing into the memories of the days when tips were fairly distributed, when he calculated and divided every tip so that everyone could have enough to eat and live. Michael still remembered the radiant eyes of the staff back then, eyes glowing with trust, a trust he had once regarded as a treasure. But now that trust was being twisted into a cheap privilege. Another female employee holding a tray of pancakes stood quietly behind the counter. Michael saw her hands trembling, as if every drop of sweat on her forehead was mingling with fear. The yellow light from the overhead bulb shone down, turning her gaze into a mirror, reflecting the pain. She stood there hearing the cold beep from the POS, the mocking giggles from that group of employees, and then looking down at her hands damp with sweat from exhausting shifts, but with tips barely enough for a cheap breakfast. Michael knew she was asking herself whether hope still existed. For a brief moment, he imagined the battle raging inside her, the voice of conscience telling her to stand up and speak out, while the voice of fear pulled her down. He saw her eyes lower, as if a door had just slammed shut on her hope once more. Michael swallowed hard, his breath coming faster. The yellow light shone down like a torch, illuminating the marks of time on his face. He remembered the sleepless nights drafting the transparent tip-sharing policy, the first days he and his partners set up tables, measured every spoonful of coffee, sliced each pancake, hoping to make this place a second home for all employees. He sighed, his heart heavy. Then Michael heard Lily's whisper. Her voice was as soft as a breath, yet as sharp as a knife cutting through the air. I've recorded everything, but I'm afraid of retaliation. Michael froze. In that moment, he realized Lily's fear wasn't just the fear of losing her job. It was the fear of losing her second home, a place where she once believed every drop of sweat would be rewarded fairly. Michael's eyes flashed with determination. He knew that with just one right action, a single click on the POS, one decisive decision, he could save everything. He felt his heart pounding hard. Each beat was a reminder that the dream of justice he had once poured his whole heart into was waiting for him to save it. Michael's trembling hand reached for his now cold cup of coffee. He knew he had no time to hesitate. He knew that if he didn't act, the golden light of trust would be forever extinguished by the cold beeps from the POS screen and the mocking laughter of those traitors. And he vowed today he would reignite the flame of justice, the flame that had built Morning Glow Cafe into the second home it was meant to be. Michael stood up in the cafe, the wooden chair beneath him creaking like a warning echoing through the space. The yellow light from the overhead lamp shone down, highlighting every wrinkle on the face of the founder, who had once poured his entire heart into building Morning Glow Cafe into a place brimming with hope and fairness. Today, his eyes glowed with a resolute, determined look like a lantern, illuminating trust in the darkness. He raised the stack of evidence pages, now yellowed with the sweat of those who had believed in the dream of justice. Tips were brazenly altered, unfair shift schedules, and threatening messages to employees who dared to speak out. The yellow light illuminated every line on the paper, revealing numbers, and blurred ink lines like scars, etched deep into his heart. His voice rang out low, firm, each word like an arrow piercing through the wall of lies shrouding Morning Glow Cafe. This is your sweat and tears stolen by these managers. From today on, every tip will go to the person who truly deserves it. The entire cafe froze. Laughter and chatter died out. The POS machine went silent, leaving only the ragged breathing of those watching the truth unfold. The blue light from the POS screen, once a symbol of transparency, now lit up the face of the manager, who bowed his head, his shoulders trembling like a leaf in the wind. Beads of sweat ran down his temple, reflecting the humiliation and fear of being exposed before the light of justice. Michael turned his gaze to the young waitress. That girl who had once placed his coffee cup on the table with trembling hands, her voice hoarse as she spoke of a dinner she couldn't afford, now lifted her head, her eyes glistening with tears. But they were no longer tears of fear or resignation. They were tears of trust called by their true name, Justice. The yellow light fell on her face, transforming her into a beacon of hope for all who had once faltered in the dark. In that moment, Michael felt every beat of his heart quicken, as if in sync with the breaths of all the people around him, those who had once called this place their second home. He knew justice wasn't just in papers or numbers, but in the very hearts of those standing up to reclaim hope. And he knew tomorrow Morning Glow Cafe would be reborn, not just by a click on the POS, but through the very hearts of those who had believed in him every single day. Because someday this golden light would continue to shine, lighting the way for everyone who once believed in the dream of justice that he had poured his whole heart into building. Michael looked straight at the manager's face, now lowered in shame, stripped of its cold, confident look, replaced by a jumble of fear and guilt. The blue light from the POS screen flickered as it lit up each drop of sweat running down his temple, gathering into a bead and dropping onto the countertop like an unspoken confession. He clenched the stack of papers in his hand, his eyes still blazing like fire. His voice rose with a blend of pain, hope, and anger, like a drumbeat summoning everyone back to the truth. Look closely. These aren't just numbers on a page. These are the sweat, the tears, the sleepless nights of people who have given their youth to keep this place alive. And yet you have used this place to steal their dreams. A collective sigh escaped employees behind the pancake counter, weary servers frozen in place watching him. Each pair of eyes had once trusted him as their spiritual father. A tear fell from the eye of a young employee next to the POS, leaving a long streak on the countertop like a scar in Michael's heart. He turned to look at Lily. Her eyes still glistened, but now they shone with resilience like a small flame in the dark. Michael lowered his voice, but it still echoed, touching every wall. I once promised all of you that Morning Glow Cafe would always be a second home, a place where every drop of sweat would be valued. Today I stand here to keep that promise. He placed the stack of papers on the counter, his fingers tapping on the yellowed pages, a small sound, but enough for those close by to hear the beat of his heart steady and resolute. The yellow light from the overhead lamp shone down, highlighting each crow's foot at the corner of his eyes, marks from years of dedication, of sleepless nights, building the dream of justice he had once promised. The manager stood frozen like a statue head, bowed shoulders trembling like a door about to collapse. Beads of sweat continued to trickle down the yellow light, highlighting his gaunt features as if he were being laid bare before everyone. A sudden beep from the POS broke the silence, the familiar sound that once made Michael proud, now ringing out like a damning indictment. Michael turned his gaze toward Lily. That young woman, who had once trembled when speaking of not having enough for dinner now, stood tall, her eyes shining bright like a lantern, illuminating the entire cafe. Her gaze no longer trembled but radiated trust, resilience, the resilience of someone who had bravely documented every injustice. Michael knew the flame of justice had been lit in that gaze, and he would not let anyone extinguish it. In that moment, the air in Morning Glow Cafe seemed to freeze. Every breath became audible. The sound of a spoon clinking against a coffee cup fell silent. All eyes turned to Michael's eyes, of people who had once called him the boss, but more importantly had called him the man who keeps his promises. Michael took a deep breath. His hand was trembling slightly from emotion, but his voice remained firm. Today I stand here not to scold or blame, but to stand with all of you to reclaim justice, the justice that once belonged to everyone. Because a cafe doesn't just sell coffee, it sells trust. And we must return that trust. The beep of the POS machine rang out again, but this time it was no longer the sound of fear, but the sound of hope, of a promise being fulfilled. Michael knew with just one decision, one click, everything would change. He was ready, and he knew. The golden light today would be the light of reborn faith, a lantern of justice that he had once poured his heart into building. Under the warm yellow light of the familiar coffeehouse, Michael stood quietly amid the lively sounds of coffee cups clinking. The steady hum of the grinder is like a background melody of change. The light shone on his face, illuminating every wrinkle earned from the years he'd spent building Morning Glow Cafe into the place people called their second home. Today his eyes shone with pride, the pride of someone who had faced the truth and stood up to keep his promise. The young waitress who had once trembled while confiding about not having enough to eat now stood tall behind the bar. Her apron had been replaced with a new name tag, Shift Manager. Her eyes shone with a look of determination, her smile as radiant as a lantern brightening the faces of all the employees around her. She was living proof of a simple truth. A single tear could change an entire system. If that tear was heard and respected, now the employees who once shuffled quietly through low-traffic shifts stood with heads held high, their eyes are sparkling with renewed trust. Tips were no longer bent, and everyone now earns enough to live without rummaging for leftovers or skipping meals. Michael looked around and saw their eyes glowing like golden lights, warming a once-forgotten dream. He realized that sometimes all it took was one small change, a fair tip-sharing policy, a simple sign explaining to customers the importance of tips to rekindle hope, to chase away the darkness that had gnawed at the trust of those who had once given their hearts to this place. One click on the POS, one brief meeting, and Justice had returned, just as he'd promised on that very first morning. He'd stood behind the bar, hands trembling as he divided each tip among the staff. Now he stood quietly watching Lily, the cafe's young manager, carefully guiding a new employee on how to make a perfect cappuccino. Her radiant smile shone like a lantern that lit up every shadow that remained, the golden light shining on her face, reflecting the trust and resilience of a team that had nearly lost everything. Michael thought to himself, his voice sounding only in his own heart, one tear changed an entire system. How many more waitresses live on tips they never get? A call to the audience to comment and share so that together we can continue to write the story of justice in every cafe in the world. Justice doesn't live in the numbers on a revenue report, but in how you treat the people who have shed sweat and tears to build this place. Because behind every hastily brewed coffee, behind every smile from an employee serving customers, they are silent sacrifices that not everyone sees. Justice isn't just about sharing enough tips, but about sharing humanity, the warm look when they're tired, the handshake instead of just a thank you. Let this place always be a second home where everyone is rewarded not only with fair pay, but with respect and trust.